Okay, so before we start talking about types of graphs and means and standard deviations, let's talk about the other stuff that was in the last reading. So did anyone get through it? And you were like, oh my goodness, it was some crazy stuff. So, at least in terms of what I presented in the reading is like the most important part for an academic's career or a researcher's career. What's the most important part of the scientific method? Yeah, communication. Without publishing peer-reviewed journal articles, like your career is just not going to make it. You might be able to get a job in a research lab as a technician or something else, but if you're interested in being a researcher, which probably most of you guys are not, which is just fine. Since this is a research methods class, I thought I'd talk a little bit about what it takes to be a researcher or an academic. And without those publications, it's just not going to happen, or it's not going to happen well. So there's this term that's referred to this bias to get a lot of things published. So what's this phrase? It's not the publisher's bias, so that's not the one I was looking for. It's publish or something. Publish or die. That would be a better version of it, maybe. Publish or perish. So the whole idea with publish or perish is if you don't publish, your career is going to perish. So this creates a big reason for some people maybe to engage in some unethical practices. The file drawer effect, which actually isn't an unethical practice necessarily at all. That's a result of the publication bias. So let's talk about the publication bias really briefly. What's the publication bias? Yeah, Allison.
Oh, sorry. I was looking.
That's too bad.
I guess the more papers or books someone has out, the more credible they are, even if it's like...
Nope, not the publication bias. Good try, good try.
It's kind of the researcher manipulates the data in their way, like to get their desirable outcome.
Okay, so this is one potential unethical thing that researchers might engage in to overcome the publication bias. So when the researchers are doing things with their data that maybe are unethical, they're doing this partially because of the publication bias, which is what? Yeah.
I'm stretching, but is it do stuff that's going to most likely get published?
Yeah. So
like what's popular for the publication.
Right. So what types of things are popular to publish?
Sex.
Well, it depends on the trends.
So maybe there are some popular areas or less popular areas, but in general there are certain things. Let's say I did that study where I'm looking at the amygdala and murderers versus non-murderers, and I don't find any effect. I see that the amygdalas are working the same in both of those populations, versus I find an effect. The murderers have more active or maybe less active amygdalas, right? Which one is more interesting? Which one is a sexier result, and not in like physical appearance, but in the sense of like people are interested in.
The one that finds evidence.
Yeah, the one that finds evidence of some effect, right? So there's this bias to publish effects that are found, and if you don't find an effect, it's going to be a hard time publishing something. And part of the reason why you might not have found an effect is because you did a really crappy study. So it's possible if you do a really crappy study, you're not going to find anything anyway, even if it's there, and we'll talk about some ways that you can potentially avoid that during this class. But there's this big bias to publish effects that are found. So one effect that has been found is that prayer works. Prayer helps people. So we get a bunch of people, and let's say, I don't remember where they were having the people who were praying, but let's say people in Kentucky. We're going to get people in Kentucky to pray for people in Sweden. So there's maybe some heart center in Sweden where they're taking care of a bunch of people that have heart attacks. And as these people come into the heart attack place in Sweden, we're going to divide them up. We're going to randomly assign them. Half of them are going to get prayed for. Half of them are not going to get prayed for. Okay? And then we're going to have the people in Kentucky pray for these individuals. And we're not going to give them the contact information of the hospital or any of that stuff. So there's no way on earth that the people who are doing the praying can actually directly communicate with those for which they're praying. Why would that be important?
No influence.
And why is no influence important?
So it's
There is an issue with validity, and there is an issue with the mind over matter stuff. Like what?
if you think people are caring more, you're more likely to get better.
Yeah. So there are tons of things that have to do with placebo effect. People are sick, you give them this pill, you tell them it will help. And they believe you because you're a doctor and you're paying a lot of money for that sugar. So you think it's going to work. And what happens as a result of this? Well, your stress levels decrease. And with decreased stress, you have less cortisol. With less cortisol, your immune system actually gets a boost. So your body's better able to fight infection and other things and heal more rapidly. So if the people in Sweden knew that they were being prayed for, actually I picked a bad country because Sweden, they're not the most religious of folks. But imagine that a large number of them believed in the power of prayer, and we told them, hey, people are praying for you, it's going to be okay. This would potentially induce effects just because of their feelings about what should happen, as opposed to any real type of effects. And so one researcher found, oh my goodness, look at this. We have people that are praying for these people over here, and these people got better. Wow. Why isn't science more interested in this? Why are people like shouting this from the rooftops and all this other stuff? And there are lots of interesting findings in the psychological research that never get replicated. They're never shown evidence for, again, after this initial demonstration. What does that suggest? So with the prayer thing, actually a number of other people looked at that. They had different groups of people praying for other individuals. And in one situation, they found out that the prayed for group did better. In one situation, they found out that the prayed for group did worse. And in lots of situations, they found out that there was no difference. Right? So what does that suggest about the finding?
God works in mysterious ways.
Yeah, that could be one interpretation. God works in mysterious ways. The scientific consensus would be like, don't worry, there's no point in studying the power of prayer. If you're a religious apologist, you might say, well, God doesn't like to be tested, so the scientific test's not really going to work out anyway, which is just fine, and that may be. But at least from a scientific perspective, it appears that most of the evidence doesn't support that. So if you find something out there that's interesting, and other people haven't pursued it, or you can't find evidence that other people have pursued it, it's probably not that other people haven't pursued it. It's more likely that other people have pursued it, especially if it's some really interesting finding. But it's just that the results didn't turn out to be significant. So if the results don't turn out to be significant, they might try to publish it, but the publishers might say, no, we don't want to waste our valuable journal space with something like this. We want to publish good science that finds good, results where there's actually evidence for something. And you found evidence of nothing. That sucks. So that stuff doesn't get published. It ends up where? Well, the file drawer was before people were carrying around thumb drives or the cloud. So I guess now you could call it the cloud effect or the thumb drive effect or something. But the idea is that work has been done. It just hasn't gotten out there. Partially because of the publication bias. So there are some things that have been created to overcome the publication bias. One of them I'm thinking about are pre-registered articles. What's a pre-registered article? For the athletes in the class, there may have been sports camps that you attended, either in college or when you were younger, and you may have been able to register for the sports camp. And what does pre-registration do?
You get a spot before it's up to the general public.
Yeah, you get a spot. So pre-registration of an article basically guarantees you a spot in that journal as long as you meet a couple basic requirements. So getting a journal or an article successfully pre-registered involves almost all of the steps that we had up there. So you do an observation, you come up with the question, you come up with a way to test the explanation that you've come up with. You figure out what analyses you're going to use based on the results of that test. You do the communication. You indicate what the question is, why it's important to answer, why we should waste our time thinking about it, or why it's not a waste of time thinking about it, how exactly you're going about doing things, analyzing your data, and what you expect to find. So you've done everything except actually test your explanation and analyze the results. Does that make sense? So at this point, you don't know how the data are going to come out. You don't know if they're going to support that there is an effect, or they're going to refute the idea that there's an effect. So why would this be a good thing? Pre-registration.
Is it guaranteed spot?
But why is guaranteeing someone a spot a good thing?
They're going to put out the basic everything rather than altering it to what people might want to hear or doing it in a different way.
Well, so some of the biases as far as like what people want to hear might still come into play, because if you're going to talk about an old theory that people aren't really into anymore, maybe that's still not going to get you pre-registered. But if you can frame it in such a way that gets you pre-registered, why is that good? How does that combat the file drawer effect?
People are putting stuff out there, even if it's like old or might not be significant. At least from a sales point of view.
It's the not significant stuff that's really crucial. So if you get an article accepted in a pre-registered form, that means that the people who have reviewed this article have agreed that there is this question out there that needs to be answered. And they agree that your potential explanation might have a good chance of answering that question. And they've agreed that the methods that you come up with are a good way to test that explanation. So they say, yeah, everything looks great. I wonder what's going to happen next. It's sort of like a cliffhanger, right? This is episode 1. What will happen when we do the test? And so then maybe we do the test and it turns out, no, this explanation is crap. It didn't work at all. Or things came out completely the opposite of what we expected. But still, those data then are out there. They're out there for everyone to be able to see and for everyone to potentially learn from. So even if you don't find anything, that information that may have taken months or years to accumulate is out there and not just sitting in someone's file. It also helps individuals avoid negative practices like p-hacking. So in psychology, p is typically used to refer to probability. And if you've had Dr. Timmerman in your intro class, which I think many of you guys have, you may have learned something about this. P is less than 0.05, which means what, basically?
There's less than a 5% chance.
Of what? There's less than 5% chance.
Than it being a coincidence.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. There's less than a 5% chance that the results that you found or other results like those that you found are just due to pure coincidence or are just due to pure dumb luck. So, people set up their tests, so if they find evidence where there's less than a 5% chance that your results or those like that would have just occurred by pure dumb luck, then the researchers say, aha, we found a statistically significant effect. It looks like there's strong evidence in support of some idea, even if it might not be the original explanation that you came up with, right? So there are a whole bunch of things that researchers can do to get the p down under 0.05. Like what? Do any of you guys know some things that they can do?
You can always make your group size bigger.
Yeah, you can take more participants. So when you're designing an experiment, one of the things that you should do is decide on how many participants you're going to have before you collect any data. So you say, aha, you might run a power analysis. A power analysis is going to tell you how many individuals you need in order to have a certain probability of detecting a certain effect. So you say, okay, I've run my power analysis and I need 36 participants in this experiment. And maybe you get your 36 participants and you see something like this. The result of your test is p is equal to 0.07, which means what? It means that p isn't less than 0.05, so that means basically you found nothing. So what can you do? Well, maybe you take 2 more participants. Okay, I'll take you guys. Participate, please. Let's check my p-value. Oh crap, that went in the wrong direction. Let me take 3 more. And basically we could continue adding people until we get something where we have a p-value that is less than 0.05. And at that point we stop the experiment and say, aha, we found it. But that's not proper, because this p is less than 0.05 is basically for a single test. And if you go out and collect a little more data, you haven't just done 1 test, now you've done 2, or 3, or 4, or 5. So you're massively capitalizing on chance. So this is called p-hacking. We're hacking at our data, adding things, changing things, to get a result that is actually significant. Another thing that people can do, I forget what paper this was in, but some researchers, they took a whole bunch of like crazy things and tried to predict some outcome. I forget what it was. Let's say GPA. We're going to predict GPA, and we're going to use a whole bunch of nutty stuff to try to do it. So we're going to ask people whether they prefer Skittles or M&Ms. It's maybe the Skittles lover. You know, taste that rainbow. Their minds are broad and open. They're going to do better in school. Maybe, who knows? We're going to ask people if they prefer the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. That's a good answer. We're going to ask people maybe what time of the day they wake up. What other crazy questions could we ask them?
Do you like sugar?
Do you like sugar? Probably not going to be a whole lot of variability in that one.
Some people might not.
Some people now, there's a big push against sugar. I like sugar. Do you like sugar? Pink, but it's cyan. Oh. Do you like pink? Do you like the manufacturer or the pink manufacturer? Do you prefer football or football? Soccer. Right? So we can do all of these different questions that may have absolutely nothing to do with someone's academic performance. And what should happen as a result of this? Now this is, less than a 1 in 20 chance. 0.05, it's 1 in 20. So there's less than a 1 in 20 chance that just by chance we should find anything. So, any of you guys familiar with XKCD comics?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, one person, they're little stick figures. And they often investigate philosophical and scientific questions. And there was this one comic for XKCD where people said, oh, jelly beans cause cancer, something like that. So the scientists went to investigate, and they looked at jelly beans and they didn't find anything. But then someone said, aha, it's the green jelly beans. So the scientists went and they looked at the green jelly beans. No link. They looked at the purple, the yellow, the red, the mauve, the taupe, the ochre, whatever, all the different colors of jelly beans. They did 20 of these different ones, and they found one to be related, which you would expect to by chance. So, where does p-hacking come in? If we tell someone what we've done, and we say, oh, we've used 100 different variables to try to predict academic success. And look, we found 5 of them, which you would expect out of 100, to predict academic success, then people will be like, it's just chance, man. You're capitalizing on chance. If, however, you don't tell people that you collected all those 100 pieces of data, and you're like, I was interested if Beatles listening to, and favorite type of soft drink, and something else we're interested in, or were related to academic success, and OMG, they all were. Then that it makes it look like you had this idea for looking at these particular things, and it turned out correct, and you didn't let people know actually what you really did. So by doing that, you're engaging in fraud to produce p-values that people might say, aha, there is something there, when really those are just evidence in situations like that of capitalizing on chance. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me take a look and see what I can cross off. So, p-hacking. And, all right, fabrication. So what's fabrication?
Making up stuff.
Making up stuff. So maybe one of your participants didn't finish the experiment. There are a couple holes in their data. You want the data to work out a certain way. One of the things that you could do is you could throw that participant out, not include them in the data analysis, right? Or maybe you could do something else. Maybe you could fill in that data with reasonable guesses. Now, if you're going and explaining how you're filling in your data, then maybe that's okay, because other people know exactly what you're doing, right? And they could reproduce that and see if taking that out would change the results that you found. But if you're not being open about exactly how you're doing things and replacing data in situations like that, and you're doing it in such a way to drive that P beneath the 0.05 level to come up with something significant that's going to be more likely to get published, engaging, again, in fraud. So what is fraud? What?
I have no idea.
So what's fraud?
That.
It's obtaining something. Obtaining something that you don't deserve by what? Yeah, by lying or by using some form of deceit. So I really like this blue bottle. That's just sweet. So he leaves it in the classroom, and I come in and I'm like, mine. Someone asked me about it. No, that's mine. Oh, I had one just like that. Geez, Derek, I don't know what happened to yours, right? I've obtained that by using deceit. That's fraud. P-hacking is fraud. Fabrication is fraud. Plagiarism is fraud, although plagiarism isn't exactly the same type of thing that's going on with p-hacking and fabrication, because both of those practices are meant to get you with a significant result. Whereas plagiarism isn't necessarily about getting a significant result. What's plagiarism about? Yeah, taking credit basically for someone else's work or ideas. And it's interesting, every once in a while there'll be a big case about plagiarism. And as a psychologist, I wonder how many of these cases are actually intentional. I mean, if you look at students when they plagiarize, there are some that I'm pretty sure are intentional. But a lot of times I get the sense that students really just don't know what plagiarism is. Well, I included the citation and the reference. Yeah, but you didn't quote it. Well, I didn't know that. Well, here's your warning. But sometimes, imagine, if you've been in some area for years and years and years and years, you've read a lot of information. And you may have an idea one day, and you might not realize that you read that 23 years ago in some source. This is one of the reasons that doing a thorough literature review is so valuable, to help you avoid situations in which you might unintentionally involve in plagiarism. Okay, last thing I wanted to talk about was rigging reviews. How do you rig a review? You can't do this at all places. Some places it's really hard because, well, I won't say why, because. Maybe we should ask the question, what is a peer-reviewed journal article first? Peer-reviewed journal articles, at least in psychology, are the most important type of publications you can get.
Showing that somebody else could replicate your work.
No.
It's when other professors or people in the field or professionals review your article and it actually works, like the methods are sound and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's not whether it works. It's not like they're taking the methods and redoing them. But it's looking to see whether or not the methods are logically sound for addressing the explanation that you're attempting to forward. It's looking to see if that explanation actually is reasonable, a reasonable interpretation of some phenomena that has led to some question. They look to see whether the data that you've analyzed actually support your interpretation. All this is done to vet the article for, I don't want to say goodness, but for reasonableness, right? Is this something reasonable? Knowing all that we know about some area, does this seem to make a good contribution that looks legit? So by having this peer review process, it saves journals from publishing a whole bunch of crap. It stops people from publishing their anecdotes. Oh, gee, my aunt said that she wore this copper bracelet and it just made her better. Yay. Not going to cut it in a peer-reviewed journal article. So if we're submitting a manuscript for review, how could we potentially rig the reviews?
Getting two people you know are going to give a good review on it.
Yeah, so Tori and I were buddies. We worked together. We published on the same topics before. and I've got this new article, and I know Tori's going to like it because it's going to give her some ideas, and we're going to work on it later. So when I submit the article for review by the journal, they ask me, okay, who do you think would be a good reviewer for this article? And I say, you know, Tori. Now, people don't just give one, they usually give several. So Kat and I, we've also done some research. I don't want to mention Ken, because he's like my nemesis. But Derek and I, we're pretty good. I've helped him out, he's helped me out, we're good. So I'm going to recommend the three of you take a look at my work. Or maybe even worse, I make up someone, and I get a Gmail address for someonefalse@gmail.com, and I say, oh, you know, this someone false guy, he's amazing. He does all this research in this area. He's not really that well known, but check him out, send him the reviews. Now, there are some safeguards for this. In a good edited peer-reviewed journal, the editors will look at the review requests and actually look and see if they've worked with you, if there's a connection between you and them. And if there is, they won't allow those people to review. Why? Because there's a conflict of interests. So they're looking for reviewers who won't have a conflict of interest. And if the editing board is doing the right job, they'll also look at someonefalse@gmail.com and say, that seems really weird. Let's see if we can find them, you know, at some university. Okay, someone false, no, they're not popping up. Or, oh, maybe they popped up, but it's just on this personal webpage, not on a university one. That's a bit odd. But in some situations, the journals, they haven't established procedures to avoid this. So when someone submits it and you type into the submit form that you want Kat at Gmail and Derek at Gmail and someone who doesn't exist at Gmail, those letters might go out automatically. And then come back from my friends and myself. So this has been done. This is also bad news. So, pre-registration, it's good because it helps you to publish findings that maybe aren't significant. It also helps you avoid p-hacking. Why would it help you avoid p-hacking? Well, if I lay out exactly how I'm going to analyze the data before I even collect them, I can't really engage in anything like, oh, well, I'm just going to take 2 more. Right? I get the number that I said I was going to do, I do the analyses, and that's really all there is to it. So, because I've already had my paper accepted, I don't need to engage in that. I've still got a publication, which is great, because without them, my career is going to perish. So it allows people to get the publications that they need, so long as they're interesting and are addressing a legitimate question, without having to jump through some of these unethical hoops that people who are up for tenure, or just need one more publication to secure a grant, might be willing to do when they wouldn't normally be willing to do it. Okay, so we've got publish-perish, file-door effect, publication bias. Let's talk about open data. What are open data? So some of you guys might know about open source software, like Mozilla Firefox. It's open source. You can download the code and make changes if you want. Open data is sort of a sprout of the open source movement or ideas.
People are allowed to put their own data around.
Can you be more specific?
Their own data on the subject that you're researching.
It's close. I'm not going to say no. Say it's close.
You're looking at data, there's all of it on there to find, or when the person has to have it on there, so when the other people go and look, all of it's there.
Yes. Yeah. So the idea with open data, if I'm going to publish in a journal that requires open data, when I write up my manuscript and I submit it, I also point them to all of the original data. Or maybe not all of the original data. Let's say I do something very, very sensitive, and I've collected people's names, so I could link them together across time or something. I might want to scrub their names so that way people didn't know, something very personal about this specific individuals. So I might assign them codes instead. But you still have a very raw form of data that then others can take. So I read your article and I think it's brilliant, but I question it. The data just seemed too good. So I go out and I look at your data. I have access to it. I can rerun the analyses. Being able to take the same data that someone else used, run the same analyses on them, and come up with the same results mean that those results are reproducible. So reproducibility is something that's really important, not just within psychology, but in sociology and lots of the data sciences. So by giving people access to the data and the analyses, people can verify for themselves that they can actually come up with the results that the original authors do. This is good because it's going to enhance public trust in the scientists and in the researchers, because they can look at things for themselves if they're interested. Does that make sense? All right. That's reproducibility. What's the Mini Labs replication project? Or what is replication? Someone brought up replication before. Being able to exactly repeat the previous experiment. Is that possible?
No, but
No.
under the same, with the same conditions as you can.
Yeah, so with the replication, if you are wanting to do something like an exact, what we call it is a close replication. We're going to operationalize the variables in the same way that the person that we're trying to replicate has operationalized them. We might be using different participants in a different part of the world, but everything else is as close as possible. So in replications, people have talked about exact replications, which really don't exist unless you're just doing simulations on a computer. If you're doing a simulation on a computer, you can get an exact replication by making sure that you're keeping track of the random seeds that you're using in order to generate data. You can do that, but with real people, it's just not going to happen. So you've got the exact replications and maybe a very small subset of things. Then you've got close replications, which are basically trying to do everything as close as possible to the original. And then you have conceptual replications. What are conceptual replications? Are you looking at the same explanation or a different explanation? Same, yes. Seize your confidence. You're right. You're looking at the same explanation. In looking at that explanation, are you looking at the same variables or different variables? Same and or different. If you're looking at the same variables, are you looking at them using the same operationalization or a different operationalization? Different, that's exactly right. So you'd be looking potentially at the same variables using a different operationalization. So last class we talked about the amygdala, or the amygdala and aggression, and we talked about a couple different ways that we could do that, right? So the one way might be the original, the second way is a conceptual replication, which should allow us to converge on the same answer if we found evidence of the truth the first time. So the Mini Labs replication project is this big project that's going on actually right now within psychology to take a look at some of the classic results in psychology. Some of you guys might know about the Milgram experiment. What happened in that one? Yeah, this was a shock one. So people were asked to shock somebody else. You know, if they don't get the answer right, shock them. Go. Does that really work? It worked for Milgram and a whole bunch of other people. Does it work in other places? Replications find out. So a lot of the classic results in psychology are being replicated now, if they haven't been replicated earlier, to hopefully make a determination about, is this really real, or were they just capitalizing on chance? What else have we? Registered articles. Ruby, I think I covered everything I wanted to from that last reading. Are we good? Any questions? Okay, so let's talk about graphs. What are characteristics of good graphs? What should a good graph have? I will start a graph here, and we will fill it in. X and Y axis. Which is which?
X.
X. Y, sorry. X and Y. In math, you may have learned that y is a function of x. That's an equation for a line. There are lots of other functions too. So y is a function of x, which means what?
X is this one.
X is explaining y. Y depends on X, right? So when we see graphs, where do we see dependent and independent variables?
Independent of X.
Independent. Dependent. I want to talk about Dr. Timmerman for just a minute, because this might help clarify the way that I think about independent and dependent variables. So, if you guys heard that as the temperature, oh crap.
Well, teaching doesn't like basketball.
So as people eat more ice cream, more people drown. Because the temperature is making people eat more ice cream and swim more often, which is making them drown. Anyway, a lot of times, if you are looking at correlational research, you will see a particular type of graph called a what? A normal curve is a theoretical distribution. It's not a graph type.
Histogram?
No.
Line curve.
No. Is it going to be our last? We're saving the best for last. Yes! Yes! You pronounced the last part of your pronunciation was a little odd. So it's scatter plot. But the first part, the scatter, was absolutely right. So you might see something that looks like this, right? And what does they call a scatter plot? Well, I imagine you've got your shotgun, boom! The pellets, they're scattered around. All right. This looks sort of like the Navy SEALs. They have this duckbill attachment, so that way when they shoot a shotgun, they don't like just shoot out like this. They shoot out like that, so you get maximum damage. Yeah. Anyway, so I've used that attachment on my shotgun, and I was aiming a little bit to the side. Anyway, so each one of these points represents what? A data point, a single observation. Maybe we're looking at people, and we're looking at, let's say, hair length as a function of age. And we predict maybe that as people get older, their hair gets longer. That makes sense. Wow. No really short-haired. Oh, well, I'm just stereotyping, right? Okay, how many people in here are 19? No guys. 18? Yes. Okay. So we have an 18-year-old, very short hair, 18-year-old, longer hair, 18-year-old with longer hair, right? So we might think that hair length depends on age. We could draw a scatter plot of this. We might think that drownings depend on ice cream sales. Now, to find out something like this, we're just doing a correlational study. We're just measuring two things. We're looking at ice cream sales and we're looking at drowning. But we might think that one thing is the predictor and the other is the predicted. And if we're going to plot them in something like this, we have an X and a Y. And traditionally when we have X and Y, one is a predictor of something else. So even though I completely agree with Dr. Timmerman that correlation does not indicate causation, I disagree with the conception of a dependent variable as only one that can be manipulated. Because if we believe a variable to be the predictor, then that should be the independent variable, even if we can't manipulate it. Does that make sense? Okay, so a good graph, it should have our labels. So we've got these up here, right? Labels for the independent and labels for the dependent variables. What else should a good graph have?
A good scale.
Scale. So we want to know what the scale is. Maybe this is 0, maybe this is 100, and we're actually talking about percent of items remembered on some text as a function of what? items remembered. As a function of,
Retention? Memory retention?
you mean how long the information had to be retained, or
How long you can hold on to the information?
retention interval? And what are the retention intervals? If we did a study like this, what intervals would we look at maybe? Minutes? So we put the little label there, minutes, great. And we might have something like this, so 0 minutes up to 120 minutes, maybe. And you might have a scatter plot. Or, if you're doing an experiment, what do you probably have instead of a scatter plot? So I'll put up a couple options here. Scatter plot, bar graph, histogram, or line graph. Someone said bar graph. So maybe get rid of those for a minute. And I'm just going to say 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So in the scatter plot, each point represented an observation. That observation could be a school. What % of the Common Core curriculum has it adopted, and how are students' standardized test scores going? Or it could be a person. What's your age? What's your hair length? With something like this, what do these things represent? What do the bars represent? I'm sorry, not these bars. Let me get rid of the bars. What do these bars represent? Time. So, yeah, the bars, they're centered over the times that they amount, but maybe I should have been more precise, right? Here's where additional information is useful. What does the height of these bars represent?
The percent retained.
Percent retained for what? For an individual, for the group. So for all of the groups, out of all of the things that could have been remembered, there were 63%. What else could we refer to these as? Mean, standard deviation, variance. Yeah, those are the means for the different groups, right? So the 1 hour group, maybe we had 20 people in that group, and on average, that's where they got. On average, this is where the 2 hour group got. And on average, that's where the 3 hour group got. Does that make sense? So the height of the bars in this situation, in bar graphs, are indicating the mean. What would be another reasonable graph type to plot these same data? In fact, maybe a better graph type for these same data. Line graph. So you would want to draw these, good grief, I got the creeps now. Something like that instead. Why is that better? It is. I like lines too. In fact, there are cases where bar graphs are more appropriate, but I will draw lines over them. So what makes a line graph more appropriate in one situation and a bar graph more appropriate in another situation? Well, that's why I draw lines all the time. And like I said, even if I have a bar graph, I will draw lines myself. But really, one type of graph is more appropriate for one type of data. Imagine I wasn't looking at this, but instead I wanted to take a look at student athletes, and student musicians, or artists, maybe. Yeah, go on, artists. Now again, I have 3 conditions, right? Just like I did before. I have an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Here I have students, student athletes, and student artists. So the regular students, those are not all the students. Those are the non-athlete, non-artist students. So which graph type is better for this? Aside from the whole lines look better.
Put them in their own individual groups.
They are, right? But I could easily do something like this again. I'm not saying that's what the groups would be like, just making up data. Not a histogram. Why? I would too. Well, so a bar graph would look like this, and if I did the line graph, you'd also see those differences, right? Why is the bar graph better here? It has to do with the type of variable that we're plotting on this axis. In the one situation, we were dealing with time. An hour, 2 hours, hour and a half, hour 15 minutes, hour 15 minutes, 25 seconds, hour 15 minutes, 25.37298 seconds.
Because it's a nominal variable.
Beautiful.
Instead of the scale.
So this is a nominal scale variable. So nominal scale variable is a variable that separates individuals into different groups that don't necessarily have a good order to them. Males versus females, how are you going to order that? Is one supposed to be, ahead of the other? It's nominal. Toyota versus Chevy versus Ford versus whatever. How do you order those? There's not really a good way to order those. And there's no really like half Chevy, half Ford. Right? It doesn't exist. If you think about what a line is in this thing, mx plus b, x here is continuous. We can draw a line, right? At least for this one, it's continuous. If you have some other things like tangents and whatnot, maybe not. But anyway, so you've got something continuous, and when you've got a continuous variable here, a line graph works just great. If you have some type of data that aren't continuous, then you should really be using a bar graph. Now a histogram looks a lot like a bar graph, except you've got a ton of bars that are touching one another. What do the heights of the histograms indicate? It is not percentage, remember. I could do this for like height. Have you guys all stand up and measure your heights? And each one of these bars represents what? Not a person, but the number of people. So histograms basically represent frequency information, how frequently that type of observation occurred. So we might have the highest frequency for this class, maybe 5'8", 5'10", in that group. Fewer above or below that, and fewer above that as well. Does that make sense? So the histogram, it looks like a lot like a bar graph, but the information plotted on this axis is quite different from that printed on the others. The last one, oh good, we've covered all of them. See you.